Welcome everyone to Artful Design TV, COVID-19 edition. We are online and in quarantine still. And as always, you can find us at artful.design/TV, including resources, links to things, and all the old episodes. If you did not catch them live, I'm your host, Ge Wong. And for those joining us for the first time, we are a multi-format weekly series encompassing artful design, music, coding, critical making, with helpings of history and philosophy, and live check-ins. No experience needed. All are welcome. As always, this is an ongoing kind of an experiment, especially for these times. And our co-producer and co-host is Kung-Woo Kim. And today's special guest co-host is James Landay. James is a renowned human-computer interaction researcher. He's professor of computer science at Stanford University. And I'm happy to call James friend. And welcome, James. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me here, Ge. I prefer infamous, by the way.
Infamous. I like that too. And so, James, how are you holding up in these times?
Well, like everyone else, I feel like I'm a captive in my own home for the safety of us all. And at first that's great, but after a while it starts to get to you. So I'm trying to figure out how to change it up. I like to change up my Zoom backgrounds, do anything to kind of keep me sane.
Yes, actually, if you'd like, can you show us a few of your, I know you have quite a growing collection of Zoom backgrounds.
Yeah, I think I'm up to 40. This is the one I like most recently because it's actually a video, but most videos are too disconcerting because they're moving around too fast. Whereas this is just a pan across this famous Chinese painting that's, 20 or 30 feet long that shows life along this river and small village in the during the Qingming festival. And I just got this one the other day and I kind of dug it. But I'm changing them up all the time so that people in my meetings like, oh, what has he got now? What's that? What's that's about? So just another little thing.
So I expect we might actually see you in front of different backgrounds throughout today's episode.
Sure.
And actually, this is a good time to also just check in with everyone else. How are you holding up? I don't even know what week this is. This is week 8 of Artful Design TV, and I think shelter in place, for example, in Palo Alto, has been a little bit longer than that. How are people feeling? Feel free to chime in on chat and maybe in a word or in a phrase or in a sentence, tell us how you're feeling, because I think that is, restless indeed. Hey, Brett, and I feel the same way. And I don't know, yesterday's being sick was actually a weird, almost nice in the terms it was like a reset for me. It kind of broke my schedule, which was kind of welcome. So I feel like, as usual, it's a wide range of sentiments and emotions that we're feeling. And I feel like those of us who are actually feeling like this is a time to actually be able to work on, the quarantine novel, to invent new branches of mathematics, etc. I think if you find that doable during quarantine, I think you're very fortunate. Because I feel like for me, maybe objectively there's like more time, but I feel less energy actually to do things. So I don't know how others are doing, but this is a time for us to get together. And on that point, we are going to do our weekly dance, 30-second dance. And today we're going to go back to super cool. So this will be about 60 seconds and feel free to groove as you like.
Like champagne and leather, like birds of a feather. fly. Like rain on a Sunday day, like $1,000,000 that you're giving away. Like a stray dog on the freeway, we'll fly. Whoa, 'cause we're on like a team, living inside a dream. You and me doing the thing, and we'll fly. Unbelievable, super cool, outrageous and amazing, phenomenal, fantastic, so incredible. Unbelievable, super cool, outrageous and amazing, phenomenal, fantastic, so incredible.
All right. I hope that brings a little bit of light into your Wednesday. And from here, we are going to go to our thinking about segment stuff for the day. And the topic of the day is human-computer interaction, when humans-computers interact. And of course, James has been working in this field for decades. He's one of the most renowned HCI researchers working in this topic, and we have a lot to share with you from James. And for me, just to kind of set this up, I have two things. One is a segue from last week's episode. It was all about new interfaces of musical expression, and at the during that episode last week, I pointed out this idea from Perry Cook, who said, the hard part about designing instruments isn't just the design of the instrument and how you map it, but having the courage to use what you've built and to dare to do that and having the courage to do that in front of people. That's the really hard part. And that reminded me of the sentiment that James once expressed, which is it's much easier, impossible in a matter of weeks, to come up with isolated interaction techniques and run scientific, tightly controlled studies with small artificial tasks. In contrast, designing and building real systems, which can take years, and evaluating them on real tasks with real users. While the former is interesting in academic communities and is self-perpetuating, it rarely invents anything truly new and useful. And of course, James here is talking about ways to evaluate the things that we build. And so I thought, James, before we go any further, I thought I might ask you about this, and also just to give everyone an idea of kind of what HCI means to you.
Yeah, so I mean, that sentiment came from this idea that a lot of the research work you see in the world is, hey, I invented some new widget, some new way of interacting with computing. And it's based in, somebody just had an idea or some observation of some existing artifact or control that didn't work right or didn't work well enough. And then what you do is you do a human subjects test on your new idea, where you just have a few tasks and you measure, how fast people can do it with your new widget versus the old one and how many errors they make. And then at the end of the day, you publish a paper and say, hey, look, statistical significance, mine's better. But it's not actually embedded in a real application that somebody's really using day in and day out, and to see it over kind of longer terms of use. So, I mean, that work's not worthless. We still need that, but it's that often the work doesn't kind of go to the next level of saying, okay, now that we showed it worked better in the lab, we're going to put it into this real application. So, you can imagine somebody makes some new widget to visualize something, but then you never see it in a real tool like a drawing tool or in PowerPoint or something like this, to see how does it actually work when people are trying to do their real jobs and their real things for fun. So that's kind of where that quote came from.
I mean, that really resonates with me in terms of kind of thinking about design. If nothing else, it means that the things we make, the things we design, the widgets, the tools, the devices, that their real value comes from when they're actually put into use, when they're embedded in life. And to actually see them in motion in the ways that actually, contribute to the turning of everyday life, and how they over time actually change and shape some part of society, right? In a way, anyway, that's how I read that quote, and in a way it very much reflects Perry's sentiment that, the way to maybe evaluate not just instruments, but almost anything, is to actually see it in the hands of the people they've made it for, and to see how you've shaped their behavior, and maybe over time how you've shaped a kind of a culture with that. So with this in mind, I think this is a great jumping off point. And so for James and everyone else, I thought I'd take this, for James and I, to take this this jog down memory lane in a teaching adventure we embarked in 2016, which I'd like to share with everyone, and as a jumping off point for our conversation. So this was in 2016 when James and I co-taught a course at the Stanford Center at Peking University. And so this is actually at the end of the course there that James and I co-taught, along with Jane, who I believe actually is currently in the episode. Jane, can we co-host Jane? Hi, Jane. If you'd like, feel free to say hi. I don't know if she's. Hi. How are you doing?
Doing okay. How are you?
Good. What part of the world are you in right now?
I'm now in Northern Virginia. I drove down the East Coast a little bit.
Hey, so a bit of memory lane for you as well. So feel free to chime in. So in this course, and you can kind of see that we really had a blast here, and we taught design. And James, what was the name of the course?
I think it might have been design thinking for global grand challenges.
Right. It was something to do with trying to chip away at these wicked problems that we face, whether it's education, environment, sustainability, and really figuring out like what can we do something about that through the way we design, especially in user interfaces or these things that we do in everyday life. And the way I saw it, James taught somewhat top down using design thinking and HCI, and I kind of taught bottom up using kind of artful design way of thinking about things, as well as HCI. And without Jane, I feel like this whole thing would have just completely fallen apart. But instead, we had a great time, and thanks to all the great people that were in the class, and we worked really hard. Everyone did.
The people in the class is also a thing to note, in that it was really cross-cultural, in that we took, I don't remember the exact number, like 10 to 12 Stanford students over to Beijing for the month and put them together with 10 to 12 Tsinghua and Peking University students, and then made sure that their teams were all mixed, cross-cultural, from the two different countries, as well as from their skills, trying to put people who design skills with technical people. Was part of how we composed it.
And as you can tell, after 4 weeks of working side by side every day, going out to interview people, going to the Great Wall, the Forbidden City, to Summer Palace, and eating a lot of food, we all became really good friends. And that was another part of this that was, it was both extra to the course, but it was also for me, it was an integral part of the experience, in that we not only were making things truly together, and we got a chance to understand one another in this context. Jane, anything you would like to add about about what that course was all about?
Yeah, I think it was just really interesting to have the diversity of both cultures and backgrounds kind of coming together, and having them do this need finding together and learning from each other.
Absolutely. And in this case, we kind of did what you would see. Like, this is the kind of picture you might see in like a poster for, I don't know, for design thinking. It's like a lot of poster notes, posters standing around poster boards and really thinking about talking through things. And that's some of the things we did, but we did a lot more than that, because we really thought about these issues. We built prototypes, and we gave each other feedback, and worked really hard at this, right? And in fact, here's a segment of captured in photos of a particular kind of acting out a lo-fi prototype, right, in a scenario, kind of a role playing. And I don't think James actually remembers this, do you? But I'm really glad we documented this. So for example, this is for the situation which you are on the street and you need to haggle for something. For example, here's Andrew. It's like, oh, what? 400 kwai, that's the local currency for this water bottle. And there's Tommy on the right, who's the merchant. And he's like, that's a lot of money. I need to call in the local expert. And you can kind of see on the phone is a post-it with like kind of basically a lo-fi button that he's pressing, right? Lo-fi is, and this is not actually coded in software. It's actually just prototyped here. And here comes James, the local expert. And Andrew's like, yo, I need you to bust this bargain for me. And James goes, 几块. How much? 400 kwai. No way, I'll give you 20. And by a combination of logic and personality, James is able to then persuade Tommy the merchant to basically sell this water bottle for 20, and he's happy now to part with this for 20 kwai, and mission accomplished, right? So yeah, that would be a kind of an example. And I thought here it might be a good time for me to articulate just so we're all on the same page to talk about kind of these terms a bit. And Kungwoo, Jane, James, feel free to weigh in. And this is kind of my quick and dirty kind of articulation of what these things are. So we talk about design thinking, and then we talk about artful design. Of course, this being Artful Design TV, it's kind of, we are constantly kind of asking what is artful design? Design thinking, in my view, is kind of a top-down way to think about design, and also it's a needs-based design, as in you figure out what people need and you basically design around a potential deficit. And in its emphasis in design thinking is on process. Particularly, you might kind of distill the process within design thinking to things like empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, implement, where the first two often can be thought of as, when we say need finding, that's kind of what we're doing. And let me pause there. Anything to add to this, James, Jane?
Yeah, I mean, I think this process is, that's a bit circular. It is very process based in that the idea or the popularization of design thinking was to be able to take this design process that designers have been doing for 50 or 60 years and put it into a form that can be easily taught to non-experts so that they could use it to solve problems. So it's really a problem solving technique that can be used for design, but it might be used for other kinds of problem solving, as I think we'll talk about a little bit later. And so the idea was turning it into a process so you could teach it so people could learn it very easily. And as our course showed, we could teach it to people, the basics in a day and have them start off doing stuff. So in fact, that process I think we saw there with the with me being the bargain expert was probably them doing what I would call an experience prototype, which is more, I actually consider that part of the empathy phase still. It's another need finding technique versus the kind of prototype we think of later where it's like, this is really what we're building and we're just trying to kind of get it right. So that role playing is kind of part of this empathy phase as a way to extract like what is the real problem and what are the assumptions we're making.
Right, it's still part of figuring out defining the problem statement. And of course, this is related and very deeply so with this kind of what's commonly called human-centered design, right? And these terms, I feel like have been used and possibly overused by a lot of people to mean a lot of different things. At least for the purpose of this episode, I thought I'd at least put some of this out there with any kind of additions or corrections from my co-host or anyone else in chat. For me, HCD, at least in kind of the classic Don Norman design of everyday things kind of a way, is that it's about affordances, it's signifiers, and the emphasis in HCD is a kind of on a kind of cognitive alignment. For example, does the thing you're trying to use offer you a readily usable and clear mental model of how to actually get at the affordance that the thing is there to provide you, right? Do you, given like a can opener, do you have a clear idea of actually how to use that and how much learning to do? In a way, it reflects Don Norman's, I think, cognitive scientist background. And there's an emphasis on getting to the root of the problem in HCD, in that you aren't just trying to build a better mousetrap, you're trying to figure out why what is the ultimate problem you're trying to solve. And it's just like, I guess another example might be transportation, right? I mean, there's arguably there could be a reason why all the giant railroad companies of the United States, none of them made really the transition into the airlines industry. arguably because maybe they were trying to build better railroads rather than necessarily thinking, well, people just need to get to places. And so that might be kind of a simplified and possibly oversimplified example of getting to the root of the problem. Uh, anything, anything else to add or to possibly amend?
Yeah, I would almost think that getting to the root of the problem is kind of the needs-based design step,
Mm-hmm.
trying to figure out what the real problem is. And then, yes, there's more of an emphasis on cognitive design and understanding cognitive psychology and social psychology really now as the guides in terms of what you do for doing design. So, what I try to do in that class that we taught, as well as in the class I teach here at Stanford, is almost to put these two things together, using the design thinking process as a structure, but then putting in kind of the way we think of HCI as the way we carry out some of those steps.
Indeed. And so this idea of like this need finding, right? I mean, in here, we're looking for some need, but in a way, we might be interviewing people, we might be doing some ethnography, but ultimately getting to the root of the problem seems like, people aren't always good at telling people what they really need, right? So in that sense, I think that there is a certain, it is not always straightforward. And I think in a way that's what makes need finding actually something that is challenging. And we'll come back to this. Yeah.
Are we gonna talk more about need finding later? Because I think that's kind of the crucial insight that you just mentioned.
Well, let's actually talk about that now, because I think we'll come back to this when we talk about teaching. But this is a good point to I think ask you, James. I mean, like, let's talk more about need finding. Is that, is it a science? Is this something that we figured out how to do, or is it still more of more of an art? I mean, what would you say to that?
I would say it's more of an art or a craft. So, we can teach it, but you really need to practice it and really learn how to do it by doing it, which, I think of more like craft than that there's a method that if you just follow it, you'll have it. We can teach you the kind of the pluses and minuses and the things to watch out for, but in the end, you need to do it to learn it. But I think what's interesting about it is, in some ways, the wrong perception that people have about what need finding means, or even user-centered or human-centered design. So, people often bandy about the famous quote that was attributed to Henry Ford saying, hey, if I asked people what they needed, they would just say they needed a faster horse. And Steve Jobs used to like to repeat this kind of thing about, hey, if I ask people what they need, they don't know what the future is. They don't know what's possible. And so need finding really isn't about that. It's not about asking people to tell you what they need. It's about asking them questions and observing them so that you can infer what the unmet need might be, using all the skill and background that you have and the knowledge you have about what is possible in the future. And so that's the key important thing that I think people who don't know this get wrong, is they think, oh, if I just go ask people what they need, they're not going to lead me in the direction. So it's not about asking them what they need. It's about you inferring and deciding what might be the gap from what you hear and see based on what they're doing today.
So you really have to, do a lot more than ask. You have to observe. You have to kind of, in a sense, almost feel the pulse of.
Yeah, that's why it's more of a craft or an art than a science.
So that's actually a good segue into kind of artful design, which in a way is a bottom up. And I feel like in contrast, and maybe less in contrast than it may seem, that is a kind of values-based design in the sense that it doesn't really start from a deficit or something that is missing, but rather based on what's important to people. For example, like if we say a value might be music making is good, and that might be enough for us to start designing an instrument. And rather than figuring out what are we missing in terms of music making, but rather we just like music making and we start doing it. And I would say artful design is kind of designing backwards often from the intended experience. And so this what is the consequence of experience we want people to have? And the emphasis is on a kind of aesthetic alignment and on the craft of making something really well. And the aesthetic alignment is one where I would say it's like, it's an aesthetic alignment to what you feel is good or satisfying, or in a general sense, closer to the way you think things ought to be, right? And ultimately, I think artful design has this telos, this aim of, let's design things, tools that can help us flourish as people, as individuals, etc. But I feel like these three things taken together are not incompatible. And I think that's one of the things that I think the course that we taught really showed. And yeah, and in a way, I think artful design, you don't necessarily do need finding as such, but I think you do the same thing that James, that you were just saying, is that you have to, you got to feel the pulse of the world. You got to kind of feel how people are doing, right? I mean, how people are doing, like what people are, this is why I guess why I tend to ask people in Artful Design TV, like, how are you feeling? How are you doing this week? And, I think the answers, whether terse or long, I think tell us something about it, but then we can measure also the best we can against our own experiences and to think critically about, about what this all means. And it's a process, and it's a craft. So yeah, anything else to add to that, James?
Yeah, I just think these three kind of views on it are not incompatible, and in fact could be really melded. And I think that's what we tried to do in the course, but we could probably do it better. And I think in some ways art-filled design is a stance that you take, which then if you have that kind of stance going through either design thinking or a traditional human-centered design process, will change the kind of artifacts that you might create, or even what you think what the gap might be interesting. It might even just cause you to see different needs when you're doing the need finding, because you're thinking it from an artful design point of view.
Right. I've always liked the view that I think you've tried to articulate before, which is these are different tool sets that you can bring to the whatever you're designing, to your design process. And none of these are, I think for each of these, it's actually possible to kind of do it kind of without a lot of thought. And if you don't bring a lot of thought to these, none of these are going to be like a magic recipe for you to get anything right? You still have to be creative and thoughtful in how you approach these. But each of these,
they are a magic recipe to get something mediocre, right. which is better than something that's just trash. So in some ways, it's like it can give you a minimum decent thing, but not a great thing.
Right. So maybe that's also it's true. And I think in a way I think for me, artful design came out of that kind of a crisis of almost of conscience there, of like, I appreciate that we can get something to a good place, but then it's gotta, can we do better than that, right? But I totally agree. And I really like these, as you said, is that these are different lenses I think we can kind of put on to kind of look at the world. And actually at this point, I want to open this up in chat to everyone here to kind of get your views on this kind of design process, design thinking, human-centered design, artful design. What do you think about these? And let us know, and we'll try to circle back to these if we have time from the chat, because I think these are things that kind of really do get thrown around a lot. And also each of these I think represents a kind of a philosophy and a tool set, but also, as James said, I think these are not incompatible. So here's some concrete examples. For me, I want to show you my cat feeder. This is so I have two cats, and I feel like this is something that's probably born out of a kind of a design thinking thing. So here is one of my cat, Cleopatra. So this particular cat feeder has been pre-programmed to recognize Cleo's passive RFID microchip, which was kind of implanted long before this, for kind of a permanent identification. Now, Cleo's a slow eater, so she's not going to finish her food all at once, but she'll be back. Here comes cat number 2, and this is Ada Lovelace. Now, Ada loves to eat. She'll eat everything in sight, and she's already had her dinner. But of course, now she's eyeing Cleo's food. And if this thing was just out in the open, she would just totally gobble it up. But as you can see here, this feeder does not open for Ada. So sorry, Ada, Cleo has not finished your meal yet, and you've already had your food. So that, as ridiculous as this cat feeder may be, right, it actually does solve a very specific problem very well. And maybe only one problem. And gosh, for like the $100 I paid for like $100, this is like, I was like, this better freaking work, right? And actually, this thing has just always worked. So anyway, this is it's ridiculous, and I feel like sheepish even showing this, but in a way, I feel like this does solve a problem, and there's that, and perhaps in a more meaningful context, Kungwu. I understand that you are now a PhD student at Karma, doing a lot of designs around music and interaction. But before this, you were a mechanical engineer by training.
Yes.
So
Yeah, like similar to the cat feeder, my senior project at Johns Hopkins was on pill dispensers. And it's so we saw the problem that overdose of painkillers can kill more people than motorcycle accidents every year. So we tried to design a solution where sort of a tamper-resistant machine that releases correct dosage only within the prescribed time frame. And our focus was on accuracy, because the pills can be dangerous if overdosed, and the efficiency and in economy. And we sort of had a very specific pre-planned outcome in our minds, and our process was sort of building towards the goal.
And you interviewed, and did you?
Yeah, and we had a client who was concerned on overdose for her father. So it was a very family problem that we tried to solve.
Mm-hmm. And did you end up prototyping it?
Yeah, our group made a sort of a finished prototype in year 2011. But I personally wasn't too attached to the project, that we sort of left it hanging at the prototype level. But it was actually finished in year 2015 by another team, which kind of is relieving for me.
Did they test it? Did they able to deploy it back into the situation that it was designed
Yes.
for?
Yeah, I think so. They made a lot of improvements.
Did it? And how was that? Do you know? This is after your time.
Yeah, it was after my time, so I don't have too much specifics on it, but it was kind of on media press, so hopefully it was successful.
Hopefully it worked.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the thing about a lot of, I think, also projects that at least we do in courses, right? A lot of times you finish it and you graduate, but I'm glad in this case that someone actually came back and picked this up and actually turned it into something more. And then you were building things like tell us about this.
Yeah,
it's a visual sound detector for the hearing impaired.
So this was my master's project, one of them, and I was the one who need to identify a problem and come up with a solution. And my aunt and my uncle are both deaf, just slightly after their birth. So I wanted to sort of help them somehow. And I noticed that recognition of auditory alarms, such as like fire alarm, car honks, or telephone calls, can be very difficult for them to realize and recognize. So I kind of came up with a visual sound detector that uses sound localization to detect the direction and the intensity of the sound, which is displayed by LEDs. Yeah, it was a very personal project for me.
And that's because of your family.
Yes.
Right. So, I mean, this is meaningful.
Which I think made me emphasize with them a lot more. Going back to the design process.
I mean, it's interesting. It's like, I mean, for me, I find this more meaningful than say my microchip cat feeder. And at the same time, I have to admit that there is a small emotional attachment I've developed with the cat feeder, because without it, it actually changes a lot of things. So in a way, if something for me like functions so well, even if it's super specific and honestly, like frankly, feels a bit privileged, right? That I can spend $100 on this cat feeder that reads the microchips off of my cats. There's something that emotional about that, because it's like I've gone from functionality to kind of this aesthetic reflection I have on this, but this is kind of both kind of out the gate. But the thing I have to ask you, Kangwoo, is that you've kind of went from designing things like this, right, into the pill dispenser, to designing things like this, which, for those who missed, this was back in episode 3 when we looked at audiovisual design, and this is Kangwoo's MIDI.city. This is not this doesn't really solve a problem per se, right?
Yeah.
And you in a way, you were kind of in both worlds, and I think me too, in a way. I've gone from really computer science into, I feel like we've defected into a kind of this art world, or at least an artful world. Like, how do you think about that part of it?
I definitely I definitely think that sort of the design thinking way and artful design, I agree that it's not an incompatible way. Even when I designed MIDI City, I sort of, used the design process thinking way into this design. But I definitely went from problem solving to sort of internal experience fulfilling designs, which I actually really love doing. And even if I design like pill dispensers or visual sound detector, I think I thought about the experience of the users in mind, more than sort of just problem solving or need meeting ways. But
I mean,
yeah, it's different yet similar, which is always confusing for me.
true that, and I can concur with Kangwoo that I do what I do, whatever that is, with no small amount of confusion about, which is, I think, why I think in the very first episode of Artful Design TV, and a question we continue to ask is, why do we design? And I think this question of why continues to be at the center. Like, is there value to what we do? So before we get into several of James' ongoing and some of his past projects, I think there's some great questions already over chat. For example, one of them is, this idea that, well, hey, isn't, maybe the two is like art. Let's see if I can find this here. Someone says, in my opinion, design thinking is for work solving hard problems, and artful design is for fun projects. I don't know if I agree or disagree with that. It's an interesting viewpoint. Some examples of artful design, for example, Ocarina in this, and these might go under fun projects. But is there more to them? I think that's the question, right? We've seen Simone Yetch's hilariously and intentionally poorly functioned lipstick. Like, this is, I don't know if this is a fun project or if it's solving a hard problem, but certainly there's quite a bit of engineering that's gone into this, as it has into MIDI.city and Ocarina. But here's one example of something that I would consider to be artful design that is not really necessarily a fun project, or maybe it is. And oh, by the way, one more thing is DOA last week's instrument for the shared experience of people who are deaf and hard of hearing, as well as for those who are not. And this used low frequency subwoofers to actually give all the participants the ability to feel the music as she's actually controlling it with her hands, using gestures adopted from American Sign Language. So in a way, I don't know if it's a fun project or if solving a hard problem, maybe a little bit of both. If you want to articulate it as a problem, this is like, how do we have music per se as a medium that can be shared for people who lack or at least impaired in the way that, the one facility that normally allows you to listen to music, right? So yeah. And something else that you may not consider artful design, but at least strictly speaking for myself, I think of the whole Earth catalog as a kind of artful design. And I think the reason for this is the following. Like, what is this? Right? For those, some of you might be like, yeah, the whole Earth catalog. Other people are like, what's the whole Earth catalog? Well, this is a paper-based database. It's basically a catalog, like you would actually order. You get this physical paper thing. It's rather large. It offers thousands of hacks, tips, and tools, suggestions, and possibilities for optimizing your life. And this is, you can see, from the late 1960s. And by the way, this description is from Kevin Kelly, the co-founder of Wired magazine. And pages of this just look like there's just stuff you can actually order, right? And when I was young, there was an amazing publication called the Whole Earth Catalog, which is one of the Bibles of my generation. It was created by a fellow named Stuart Brandt, not far from here in Menlo Park, and he brought it to life with his poetic touch. This was in the late 60s, before personal computers and desktop publishing, so it was all made with typewriters, scissors, and Polaroid cameras. It was a sort of like Google in paperback form, 35 years before Google came along. It was idealistic and overflowing with neat tools and great notions, and that was by Steve Jobs at his Stanford commencement in 2005. And if you look at kind of, this is 2 million copies that were sold. And in this book, recommended for or by the readers include all kinds of practical information, ranging from where to buy, seeds, tools, and clothing, to reflections of the universe, including philosophical, scientific, and geographical texts, right? That's from the book, The Whole Earth Field Guide. And finally, if you look at the function of this thing, this is solving a hard problem. Yes and no, right? The Whole Earth Catalog functions as an evaluation and access device. With it, the user should know better what is worth getting and where and how to do the getting. An item list is listed in the catalog if it's deemed, and this is on the front page of the Whole Earth Catalog, says, if it's useful as a tool, if it's relevant to independent education, high quality or low cost, and easily available by mail. So in a way, I consider this actually this catalog itself as a kind of artful design, precisely because I think 1 and 2, it's useful as a tool. It's access to tools, right? It's really the tagline here, and it's relevant to independent education. So in a sense, artful design, I think, is getting at this idea that we build tools for flourishing. And that could be fun projects, but hopefully the fun project has to, I think, be useful in a different context. For example, in this case, a self-education context. Anyway, that's at least just my take on this. And I would recommend you all to go look up the Whole Earth Catalog if you have not seen it before. And I think there's a generation of people that it's like, yeah, the Whole Earth Catalog. As always, put your thoughts and opinions on in chat. And with this, let's actually go to think about some of the work that James has worked on, and to use kind of this design thinking, human-centered design, and possibly artful design lenses to look at this. So James, maybe I'll go ahead and play this video. Before I do that, anything you want to say about the AWI?
Yeah, so I'm going to just say this is a project that I would say came more out of the artful design point of view rather than there was a need. And in fact, I'm probably not working on it anymore because I couldn't find any real good need for it, and made it hard for me to motivate, continue to work on it. But originally we worked on it because it was cool. And it also was the brainchild, not of me, but actually a very good artful designer who came from a real design background, Luke Vink, who had worked with me a few times in China and also in Seattle and then in New York on this project. So this is his vision video for the project that he started out with sketches. And then what we often do is make a vision video before we would ever build any complex system. And it probably took 3 or 4 years past this video to actually build this, long after Luke had gone on to his next gig, but he helped kick off the idea.
Should I roll tape?
Roll tape. So in some ways, this was a reaction to all these wearable devices that you'd have on your body, or Google Glass on your eyes if you wanted augmented reality. We said, how can we have an interface for augmented reality without wearing anything? So it's projected from this broadcast. Multiple people can see the same thing at once. Sometimes the purpose you show the video to people and they have other ideas for it. So some women who saw this said, oh, it could be like a security guard for me while I'm running at night. Yeah, so that video kind of gave vision for the project and try to understand. We didn't even know what people wanted. It was really originally this reaction to Google Glass, which was getting a lot of PR at the time, saying, hey, I don't want to wear that thing on my body. And so it almost led to a more dystopian view than even Google Glass, which was you have these quadcopters all around you with a projector on them. And but we eventually built it, and we built a prototype of it and showed it for tour guide scenarios and things like this.
Very cool. And actually, in a way, in thinking about the scenario of like the lo-fi prototyping and kind of that type of role playing as a form of need finding or as part of need finding, to this concept video as a vision video for what you would build, this actually speaks to, I think, a running thread through your work, which is this idea of narrative and really user and HCI, right? So, for example, the next thing we'll look at is actually who is Zuki?
Yeah, I was going to say that concept of narrative really is something that I came at backwards. You know, I wasn't really looking for narrative. I just kind of happened to keep tripping over it recently and started to go, hey, I have narrative happening in several different projects without really knowing it. So this idea of vision video has become a key tool in my research group. We do the vision video so that we can understand how is the artifact we're talking about going to fit into people's lives, rather than just looking at how does the artifact work, where the vision video kind of lets you see how is someone going to relate to it in the real world. And so that technique of a concept video is something that I've pushed down into our intro class at Stanford, where we regularly have 140, 150 students on teams of 3 or 4. So every fall there might be, 30 or 40 teams. They each create a vision video for the project before they do any real prototyping or code, even before paper prototyping. They make the vision video, and unlike what you just saw there, I try to get them to not have the actual user interface anywhere in the video. Like maybe somebody has a phone, but we never see what's on the phone. We're just experiencing what does the person experience with this new artifact. Sometimes hard to tell the story fully like that, but they'll use a little motion graphics or something. So that's the extreme version of it. But so that idea of telling the story helps us think it through as another need finding technique or another prototyping technique, as you said. And then this idea of story and narrative has come up in some of my research projects, not in terms of designing or prototyping, but instead as of an engagement technique. So how do we keep people engaged in certain things? And I think this is more common probably for a lot of your artful design tech things or for games. Narrative is a thing that we evolved to see and find and understand probably no, not even probably, for sure, before there was written language. And so people are almost evolved to see story in the world. And so the idea was, how can we take advantage of putting story in artifacts as a way of keeping people engaged? So the one that you're showing coming up here, Zuki, came out of my time living in China, but we were working on how do we get people to stay engaged with exercise or sustainability apps, because we found people abandon their Fitbits and these other things after 3 or 6 months. Half the people have thrown them away. So how do we keep them engaged? And the idea here was, what if there was a story that was a story that as you engage in your physical activity, the story changed a bit. So you see that picture in the middle is, you'll see every time, let's say you did an exercise activity, another bird appeared, and also this balloon starts to float up over the week. And then if you met your goal for the week, you move to the next chapter of the story. So there's this visual narrative as well as some small textual narratives that happen every 20% towards your goal, or when you complete your goal for the week, that kind of tell you the story as you go forward. And it has a backstory about this character Zuki, who's crash landed on Earth, and he's looking to find his brother, as well as bring back biodiversity to his planet that has been taken over by runaway global warming. And it's got him as the hero, and there's this FBI cat who's trying to catch him and things like this. So, you know, we've tested this in the field and have a large field study going right now. But what we found is that people have the story version of this versus a version where you just see the same kind of continuing screen, like one chapter every week, let's say just these 5 screens here instead of the 13 chapters times 5. The people who have the story version engage more, do more exercise, stay with the app longer than those who don't.
Interesting. So in this sense, the narrative and the storytelling is both something we use as designers, but also is something we built into the design in order to have a kind of, you know, goodly engagement. In this case, right, this is part of your project for behavioral change, specifically behavior that people know that they want to engage in, but perhaps don't have trouble across time, you know, for example, engaging with. And I guess in a similar vein, you know, the smart primer, and it's another one of the projects that you've been involved with. This actually literally came out of a story, did it not?
Yeah. So I'm starting to think my last sabbatical was quite productive. So I was living in China on sabbatical in Beijing back in 2009 to 2011, and in 2010. The iPad came out, the first iPad in 2010. And I remember really having this anticipation that I really wanted to get one of these. And even though it was made in China, I couldn't buy it in China because they didn't, you know, it was only available first in a few countries like the US first. So I remember taking a trip back to DC to go to a National Science Foundation meeting, but my real goal was to get up early on the next Saturday morning and go wait in line at the Crystal City, Virginia Apple store and get my iPad so I could take it back to China. And I remember getting this device and saying, oh my God, this is the Young Ladies Illustrated Primer. So this came out of this 1995 novel by Neil Stevenson called The Diamond Age. And it's got this totally crazy subtitle in small letters you see there, or comma, a Young Ladies Illustrated Primer, which is the real thing that the story is about. It's this tablet-based computer that is an educational device, but it's in the form of a story, a narrative. And the girl who gets this actually becomes almost part of the narrative. And for her to push the story forward, she has to learn things over years. So it's a narrative that goes on for years and years. She learns how to read, first of all. She learns math, she learns physics, she learns stranger danger, she learns martial arts, she learns survival skills. So it's like a complete primer, i.e. British school book on everything. And I remember being in grad school in 1995 when that came out at Carnegie Mellon. My friends were some of the best AI and machine learning people in the world, and we read it and we thought that could never be built. You would need perfect AI, or what today you might call AGI. 15 years later, when the iPad came out, I thought about it again. And I said, we've made a lot of progress in machine learning. There's a lot of content. There's Khan Academy, all of these things. And I thought you maybe could build this now. But the hard part actually is, how do I even make a story that somebody's going to want to read for years. So even, lowering the bar to say, hey, can we do this for weeks or months? And so that was the germ of this project. And again, we made a vision video, and we've been building this probably for the last 3 years at Stanford, trying to first show that if I give you educational activities that are embedded in a narrative, that you'll actually learn more than if I just give you the educational activities by themselves. So we have the narrative, we have this personal media the child has it on, we have educational activities, and then we personalize it through context. For example, your version might be different than someone else based on where you live or what your reading level is or what your math level is. It's going to personalize based on that content. And then the thing that's probably new that we didn't have when we originally thought about it was, what happens when you get stuck? If you don't have a teacher or a friend you're working with, what can we do? And so we've been working on a tutoring chatbot that students can ask questions of and get help. And so our most recent study of this showed that in the condition where someone had the narrative and the tutoring chatbot, they actually did learn more than in the case where they just had the learning activity alone by itself. So the chatbot and the narrative together seem to have the impact. So we're now trying to build that for real. That was a Wizard of Oz version for that study. And so that project's got people from across education, as well as AI, as well as me and HCI and design trying to build this.
And as I understand it, you've run a course before in which you've, at least as part of the course, you've basically read like science fiction or speculative fiction novels. And in a way, you have everyone, I don't know, like reverse engineer the things that you would find in there. Is that?
Yeah, I didn't really run a course per se, but I had like something as a computer science professor I thought I would never do. It felt like a tweed jacket wearing kind of English professor thing. I had a reading group with 6 to 8 Stanford undergrads where we read this novel, The Diamond Age, week to week, and tried to reverse engineer what was the spec for the smart primer, the Young Ladies Illustrated primer that was in the novel, because there's nowhere where it's like, here's a spec sheet for this thing and this is what it does. So we wanted to kind of go, okay, what are we seeing here? What does it do? And write down all the features for this thing, and then think about which of these things do you really need and which of them are just great to have in the novel to make the novel more interesting. Like in the novel, you could take it, the girl, some mean boyfriend of her mom takes it and throws it across the room at her head, and it just gently floats down and doesn't hit her. And we're like, we're not building that. So that was good for the story, but which things do you really need? And which things do you need in the basic, version 1 versus version 2? For example, it could infer her emotions and adapt. I think that would be great in a learning device, but probably we won't do that in the first version of it, but it's on the roadmap.
I have to say, as someone who's trained in computer science, but also someone who likes tweed jackets at the same time, I think that sounds like a wonderful idea for computer scientists to have a reading group that's actually about literature and critically thinking about kind of the culture and the times that we could live in, and to kind of map it in a way back onto our times and kind of our more immediate future. So I think I'm not the only one. I see also at least Patrick, for example, says I would totally take that course, and so would I. So
yeah, well, I would say the other weird part about it is I've kind of, as I said, walked backwards or almost tripped over narrative I wasn't conscious about, oh, I'm putting narrative into a couple of these projects, but you can see it in Huizuki as a visual narrative. And in the Smart Primer, it has visuals, but it's more of a textual narrative. To get help with these projects, my students found a narratologist. And that's a word that I didn't even know existed 2 years ago. A narratologist is pretty much an English professor who's an expert on narrative. And so, we have Stanford professor Paula Moya, who's been, consulting on these projects and really helped us make the narratives and the stories better for people, more engaging, more interesting. So yeah, narrative is a thing where we just tripped over it, and now, we're being more conscious about how we do it.
That's fantastic. And by the way, for everyone here, time check, it is just after 2 p.m. So I know those who have to either go to meetings or have just Zoom fatigue. This is also just a reminder that this is the time. We're going to go on for just a little bit longer and to wrap up. But one more project to talk about and maybe just some concluding thoughts and any discussions and questions you may have. So I'm just letting you know. So the last project we're going to talk about, and you have so many projects, James. I mean, your career has spanned many places and topics. You've taught at Stanford since 2014. You were at Cornell Tech and NYC before that, and you taught for at least a decade at University of Washington, as well as being research fellow at Microsoft Research and Intel. So we can only get to a few of the projects that you've done, but this last one we're going to talk about is hybrid physical plus digital spaces. Tell us about this project.
Yeah, so this is one of my latest projects that's joint with Professor Sarah Billington, who's in civil engineering. And Sarah and I actually met in a design thinking course at the D School, because as I came to Stanford, I thought, hey, I want to really see how they teach this, to see what pieces of design thinking as a process I'd put in my own courses. So she was one of the other faculty who they led into their executive education thing during spring break. So Sarah came to me like a year or two later and said, hey, I had an interesting idea. She said, I was in a horrible meeting the other day. And the reason it was horrible is she was in this conference room in the faculty club, and it was like cement cinder block walls, and there were no windows. And she said, it didn't matter what the content of the meeting was, the space just made me feel horrible. And she said, do you know much research about how does the built environment affect our well-being and how we feel? And I said, well, I don't know a lot about that, but that's really interesting. So we started this project called Hybrid Physical Digital Spaces, where we're trying to increase the scientific knowledge of how do different things about the built environment, for example, natural light versus artificial light, or natural material furniture versus artificial material, or images on the walls that include diverse people versus a bunch of white guys. How does that affect people's sense of stress, their belonging, their creativity, their physical efficacy, their environmental efficacy? Like, how does it really affect our well-being? And so in this project, we're working at doing studies where we control these variables and see what happens. We just ran a big study of 400 people in 2 offices that we manipulated. We're getting ready to move out into naturalistic office environments, which the whole study is now changing because COVID-19. We're actually really interested in how do these things affect people that work at home, and then what are the perceptions of the transition back into the office space. And finally, from more the design perspective, the part I'm interested in is what kind of interventions could we dynamically make in office space that might change your sense of well-being when things are happening. So let's say we sense you're stressed. Maybe we manipulate some pieces of the lighting or the sound in your environment. And how do you do that in non-creepy ways so this doesn't just become the Clippy of buildings, right? So how do you design this in a way that people are going to want such a thing? And then how do you deal with all the privacy and other kind of issues you have where this might seem like, oh, I don't want my boss to know that I'm stressed out. So, there's a lot of people here I know on the line who have dealt with these issues in the ubiquitous computing world, et cetera. Scott Miniman, I see out there. A lot of people have thought about how space affects people for a long time. So this is a really interesting way to do this. And it's kind of nice because we have a team that has civil engineers and architects and psychologists and education people and medical people all together trying to push that forward.
This is really inspiring because this is, kind of a really melding user interface design, machine learning or AI in some sense, well-being, as well as a bit of architecture, and a lot of architecture actually, in thinking about how these spaces shape our well-being and through kind of the way through the context, the physical context in which we find ourselves. So in a way, I mean, coming back to this, where we started with kind of design thinking, human-centered design, artful design, I mean, these are names we give things, but I love that in your work that you seem to just effortlessly meld these in whatever measure they happen to come in. And in fact, there's a question, I believe from Katie, um, I think is a great one as well. Do you think about the implicit narratives that people will assign to your design work, regardless of intention? I guess this is potentially related to this, but also just to all of us who design.
Yeah, I think Katie has a great question there. I'd have to say I haven't thought about it a lot, but I do know that people will. The one thing that I learned that actually led to this project is we had this thing called UB Green, and it was to encourage green environmental behavior. And there were two versions of it, but in one version there was a polar bear on a small piece of ice. And as you did more green activities, the ice grew and the polar bear got a mate, and then they had cubs and there were more seabirds and fish. And at the end, if you met your goal for the week, the northern lights came out. And originally we thought, oh, that's just like a nice bar graph that is kind of more aesthetic. It's more artful in that way. But people in our interviews said things like, oh yeah, I rode my bike to work today because I wanted to get to the next level of the game. Or I took the bus because I wanted to get to the next part of the story. And we thought, what story? We didn't design a story. That's actually what led to that Huazuki project was, oh, people are seeing story even where we didn't explicitly design story. So why not explicitly design stories so that we can lead people the direction we want? But I think Katie's right in that people will see story in our design. So you want to probably be aware of that and help shape that story if you want that story to have some useful meaning in the artifact you're making.
Yeah, and I would add to that, and I totally agree with James in that yeah, Katie is a wonderful question. Is I think there's some, on one hand, I think there's like nothing we can do about that. And people will make of things as they will. And that's a good thing. I think that people have the autonomy to actually make of what they take away from a design. But then I think when designing, it seems like there is an opportunity to shape that implicit, or at least to shape the conditions that I think a lot of times design could come with its own aesthetic manual, right? As in like ways to actually engage with the design beyond its functionality. And in a way, I think there's a way to at least do your best to shape the implicit narrative by setting the conditions. But also I think it's important to leave autonomy for the user. And I think somehow, I think designs that really work both give you the tools to shape that narrative and nudges maybe at you to think about a certain way. But at the same time, you really feel like it genuinely gives you the autonomy and the agency to kind of use it for your own way. And yeah, this is all to say I also don't know, but it's something that I think about a lot and strive for. And so actually, you know, James, there's so much more we could talk about, but I thought maybe we'd wrap up by asking you, you know, kind of where you see the role of HCI, of design, kind of in today's world with kind of AI kind of coming in hot, as it were, and then very much already here in shaping our everyday lives to all the other things that is happening, right? I mean, where do you see the role of HCI, and also how do we get this across to our students?
Yeah, so it's something I've been thinking about for a while. I was one of the co-founders and now one of the associate directors of the Institute for Human-Centered AI here at Stanford. And for me as an HCI person who always felt like, God, HCI and design, we're always on the outside in the computer science world. We're always, oh, those are those weird people who deal with people. You know, everyone else deals with machines and algorithms and math. It was kind of really, I thought, a big deal that the AI people really saw the importance of HCI and design and human-centeredness from the start of this institute, from when Fei Lee and Chris Manning and I started talking about it. And, you know, I've kind of hold that torch in that group to try to keep those human-centered values, at least from the kind of design aspect. It's also human-centered from the social impact. But as I've looked at the area more, one might think, oh, if we have AI, we don't need HCI or design as much because the AI will just kind of do the right thing. the fact is, if you look at these autonomous systems or smart systems or whatever you want to call it, they need design more than ever, because now they actually create systems that are not always going to do the same thing for people, so they're less predictable. That requires better design to figure out how you're going to communicate that. There's systems where you might need people to take over from autonomous systems. So think of your supposedly autonomous car like Tesla that really doesn't drive itself, and you might need to trade that off with people. Again, these are hard design problems. So many of these AI systems need HCI and design more than ever. And so it really, I think, has created a bigger role for design being involved from the start in a lot of these AI-based systems, because you got to get the design right to be able to communicate all the things they're going to fail at. Like, they don't do the same thing every time, and understanding, you know, when something's going right or wrong is really about design and how you communicate it.
I mean, I would totally concur with that. And, you know, for me, the hardest part of teaching design is not the design. It's not the technology. It's not the techniques for any particular discipline. It's not a, you know, AI, for example, insofar as the AI itself, but everything around it, right? Like how it fits in the world, into society, and how it shapes the world and society, and how to think about that. And I think for me, it's like, I feel, I don't know, I mean, maybe the human-centered challenge, or even just, I've actually gone even beyond human-centered in a way, in thinking about like, well, what about like the environment? That's not human-centered. I mean, it may serve humans, but also environment as an end in itself. What about, I don't know, animals? What about AI? What about if we actually one day achieve AGI, artificial general intelligence? Should they be accorded rights unto themselves, right? These become almost extra human-centered in a sense. And I have to wonder, on the flourishing end, like, what does it mean to flourish? You know, who gets to flourish? So for me, it's like almost like in classes, I'm wondering, you know, have I taught my students not only skills, but like the sensibility to use these skills? If I taught them to seek, I don't know, wisdom beyond intelligence. And I feel like that's kind of this challenge that's facing all of us today. And at this point, maybe if anyone has questions, please blast them into chat, and we'll spend the next minute or two. We'll do our best to answer any remaining questions that people have. I imagine people have a lot, because I think
I really resonated with Katie's comment here again, that even the task of describing AI is a design challenge, right? You know, so people even understand it.
Yeah, like what is it, and what does it do for us? And I think there's a huge also question of autonomy, right? And I think this seems like the topic for another episode. But I think the question of, even if we could have AI just do everything for us, quote unquote, perfectly, would we want that, right? Are there things that, do we want to shape our own destiny in a sense? Or do we want to have it shaped for us, even if it's shaped for what's another intelligence thinks is good for us? So I think a lot of open questions. Any other thoughts here? There seems to be a lot of traffic over chat. Thanks to Kungwu, this chat will make it into the recording, so feel free to come back and view this with a kind of with a running commentary. So one more question from Suyash. James, the video must take a lot of time and effort and fancy software to put together. How do students go about it in class?
So that's a good question. I was teaching video prototyping in my class probably for 20 years now, maybe 25 years almost. And I was teaching it more as, yeah, you should just know about this technique. Some people do these prototypes with video, but I didn't require the students to do it because it was just too hard to make video. You know, you needed expensive equipment, and the editing software was horrible. And then I realized when I moved to the University of Washington sometime in the mid 2000s, you know, maybe it was around 2005 or so, 2006, people started to, we had much more inexpensive cameras, you know, and a few years after that, the iPhone, everyone had kind of a camera in their phone very soon. But even before the iPhone, the digital cameras were getting really cheap. In fact, I was able to just buy a bunch of cheap ones and give them out in class and say, hey, you could use this. And then at the same time, things like iMovie and Microsoft had Windows Movie Maker 1 and 2, just made editing video so much easier for simple videos that I tried this in an advanced class, and it went so well that I pushed it down into the introductory class to do this video. And so it is a pretty tough assignment, but the videos that the students do in the class are nowhere of the high quality that you see in that video for AWI that Luke probably spent. He probably spent 2 months, 6 weeks to 2 months, designing and shooting and editing that video. So that's a high-end video. The ones that students do in the class are much more low quality than that, though some of them every year you'll get 1 or 2 where you're just like, wow. And they do it in under a week. So they have 1 week to do this, and they have other classes going on at the same time. So, you really can, in a week of part-time work, shoot a video, edit it, and get a pretty good idea of what the experience you're trying to do. So I try to really encourage them to take really lo-fi techniques to put that together.
And given the time, maybe we'll have this last sentence from Mariko, who I think provides a good culminating comment for, I think, today's discussion. Going back to the issue of design thinking and/versus artful design, design thinking seems to provide frameworks to exercise human-centered perspectives, and artful design provides the, quote, wisdom beyond intelligence. Yeah, what do we think about that? James, I'm going to give you the last word on this, but I can quickly say, for me, I don't know if any one of these design philosophies necessarily provides the wisdom. I think the wisdom in a way has to come from within, but I think artful design is one that tries to say, I think seeking wisdom has to be part of the design process, but I don't know. Beyond that, I think wisdom is one that I think has to come from the person, much like creativity of doing anything. And 2, I think wisdom is super situational. I think you have to kind of learn to adapt and figure out what to do in the situation. But maybe, in keeping with the theme of today, I think there are no strong answers, absolute answers to things. But I like maybe a melding of these different ways to think about how we design. I like this. But anything to add, James, or any words you want to leave us with?
So we didn't talk about it too much when we hit at it a little bit about, if we think about design thinking, we often think about the need finding and then finding the problem and then thinking about how we're going to solve it. Sometimes that is not a technological solution is the right solution. It might be an organizational, or it just needs some money or something else. We tend not to go that direction, in my class or in my research group, because we're computer scientists. So we're looking for ways to use computing technology. And then sometimes we also start with a technology like that drone. Hey, with a drone, what can we do? It kind of may sometimes start that way, which would not come out of the design thinking kind of approach as much as the artful design approach. So sometimes I think it depends if you're starting top down or bottom up, which way makes sense. But I also think artful design as a stance, an aesthetic view, could also be put into even that traditional design thinking process that might be top down, how you put it. So I think they can fit together quite well.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, James, thank you, Jane, thank you, Kung-Woo, and thank you all for a fascinating discussion. I think this is one of those things that I think needs to be continued, and there are no final answers here. So thank you all. Before we end, we're going to dance one more time, and before we do that, James, thank you once again for being with us in Artful Design TV, and thank you all.
Thanks for having me.
All right, y'all know what to do. Whoops, I need to share my screen.
phenomenal, fantastic, so incredible. Woo! We gotta bring both sides together, like champagne and leather, like birds of a feather. We'll fly, like rain on a sunny day, like $1 million that you're giving away, like a stray dog on the freeway. We'll fly, whoa, 'cause we're on like a team, living inside a dream. You and me doing the thing, and we'll fly. Unbelievable, super cool, outrageous and amazing, phenomenal, fantastic, so incredible. Unbelievable, super cool, outrageous and amazing, phenomenal, fantastic, so incredible.
All right. Thank you all very much. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay artful, and take care of yourselves. See you next week.